Hello, welcome to Vendor Responsibility Basics, brought to you by the Office of the State Comptroller's Vendor Responsibility Team. During this training, we will discuss what it means to be a responsible vendor, the reasons why conducting a responsibility review is important, what leads to a thorough vendor responsibility review, subcontractor responsibility reviews, and we'll provide some recommendations that you may find helpful. Why is a vendor responsibility review important? It protects the agency and state against failed contracts. For example, discovering a vendor is near bankruptcy and doesn't have the necessary resources before the contract is awarded can help ensure the contract is awarded to a vendor who can provide the required goods or services. The agency's need to terminate the contract early and to initiate an early rebid can be prevented. It proactively solves and mitigates problems. If an agency learns up front of a vendor's shortcomings, they could modify the language to minimize risk. For example, an agency can change its standard 5-year term language to 1 year with 4 one-year renewals. It avoids contracting with non-responsible vendors, such as vendors with prior non-responsibility determinations or vendors with ties to organized crime. A responsibility review allows you to get to know your vendors before your agency enters into a contract. Lastly, a responsibility review helps to protect public funds and promotes fairness, ensuring state money is going to reliable vendors who meet the necessary law and business requirements. Remember, it's easy for a vendor to appear as the winning bidder if they're not playing by the rules. For example, if they're not complying with the workers' comp and disability insurance requirements and/or prevailing wages. The Guide to Financial Operations identifies 4 responsibility factors that vendors must have. First is the financial and organizational capacity to perform worker services. Does the vendor have the assets, equipment, facilities, personnel resources, and expertise to complete the contract? Next is the legal authority to do business with the state. Does the vendor have the required licenses, such as professional licenses like architecture and engineering, or service licenses like alarm installers or security guards? Are not-for-profits registered and current with the New York State Attorney General's Charity Registration Bureau? Are they pre-qualified in the Grants Gateway? Are corporations properly registered with the New York State Department of State or State Education Department for schools? And do they have current workers' compensation and disability insurance or an exemption? Third is integrity to justify the award. This is the most gray area and can include management's philosophy, legal troubles, criminal indictments and convictions, civil fines and penalties, investigations by government entities, and ethical violations. And finally, a good record of past performance. Has the vendor had prior contracts with your agency or other state agencies? Open Book is a great resource to identify other state agencies who've worked with this vendor if your agency hasn't. A thorough review consists of 2 components. The first calls for reviewing all of the information the vendor self-discloses in response to the requirements set forth by your agency in the solicitation document for the contract opportunity, typically the vendor questionnaire or VRQ. The other is your agency performing an independent review of the vendor's responsibility by using available resources to search for apparent, adverse, or concerning information. We'll discuss these resources further in this presentation. If the vendor discloses apparent adverse information, your agency will want to verify and assess this information to determine whether the self-disclosed issues will affect your agency's responsibility finding. Likewise, if cautionary information is found during your agency's independent review, you will want to address these findings with the vendor and assess whether these findings will impact your agency finding and the vendor's responsibility. Remember that non-disclosure of required information is an issue itself. Just as your agency conducts an independent review, so does the OSC Vendor Responsibility Team. The following resources are considered best practice resources that OSC's Vendor Responsibility Team use on a regular basis in our reviews. While we enjoy talking with you, A less than thorough review of the resources available is a significant reason for the follow-up emails and calls that you get. The Office of the State Comptroller's website is a very useful resource. It provides information on the vendor responsibility review process, including how to conduct a VendRep review and how to make a responsibility determination, as well as VendRep documentation requirements, the vendor questionnaires, and agency vendor responsibility profiles. These are in both Word and PDF versions. This resource also contains detailed information on how you and vendors can enroll in OSC's online system and allows those already enrolled to access the most recently completed forms. The VendRep system affords vendors the opportunity to file, update, and certify their responsibility online and gives you the ability to review these vendor disclosures electronically, instantly. Let's take a look at the Research Vendor Information screen available on the OSC website. The resources are broken down by the VendRep factors. These 5 resource category links provide the names of the information resources and links to the websites. The VendRep Resource Guide lists not only the link, but additional basic information, including description of service, application, access to the information, timeliness or accuracy of the information, and finally, cost for the service. There are some resources that OSC uses which require paid subscriptions. For example, LexisNexis, Accurate, and Accurate Advance, and others where the agency must request and receive permission for access, such as New York City Passport System and DOB's Grants Gateway. You are required to perform an affirmative VendRep review. What does this mean? It means you have to do something to support your determination. How do you start? By asking the vendor to complete a vendor responsibility questionnaire. It is considered a best practice for you to encourage vendors to enroll and to use the VendRep system to create and certify questionnaires online, and for you to enroll and be able to review those online VRQs. The VendRep system's welcome packet contains the mandatory language you must include in your bid solicitations regarding vendor questionnaires. You must notify vendors that an online questionnaire is available for this procurement, and you must provide vendors with instructions on how to enroll in the VendRep system. If a vendor does not have a New York State vendor ID, they or the agency will need to obtain one in order to complete a VRQ. Finally, you must allow vendors the option of completing and submitting a paper version of the VRQ. Does the vendor have the legal authority to do business in New York State? The New York State Department of State only requires specific corporations, Incs., LLPs, LLCs, out-of-state or foreign companies with offices or employees within New York State to register. You'll enter information into the search fields. For entity name, you will enter the vendor's name. This is a sensitive search feature, so less is more. Name type should be all. Search type should be contains. Enter a CAPTCHA and click search button. You are looking for an active status. If inactive, dissolution by proclamation, or annulment of authority by New York State tax, it usually means that the vendor owes New York State back taxes. You should follow up with the vendor to obtain an explanation and evidence the taxes were paid, and check that the status has been updated to active. Any questions on this resource should be directed towards New York State Department of State or tax. What if I can't find my vendor here? You may have to ask the vendor where they received their permission to do business in New York State, such as the SED or the county clerk's office. Google is a great all-purpose type search engine resource. In searching this resource, you can find issues or potential cautionary information that touches upon the VR factors. When searching Google, start on the main page, enter the vendor's name, and then view the multiple pages of hits scanning for potential cautionary information. You should also search on affiliates and key owners and officers, as the vendor questionnaire requires the vendor to disclose information on these as well. Then, depending on the sheer volume of hits, you can also search the advanced Google. Here we can choose parameters in an attempt to reduce the volume of results and try to find more cautionary information. This slide shows how we can search the vendor's name along with keywords such as lawsuit, investigation, settlement, fraud, or penalty. This will help you zero in on the most cautionary information. There are other advanced search options available, like setting the time frame of the results, or searching specific domains, like .gov, .org, or .edu. Does the vendor have any New York State tax warrants? This would be VendRep factors, integrity, and financial condition. Search vendor, affiliates, owners, and officers' names. Select all for warrant notice status. Vendor may have open and/or satisfied New York State tax warrants. Federal tax liens are filed as Uniform Commercial Code or UCC liens. They are also found by searching the Department of State website. The only way to get all federal tax warrants, including those issued in other states, is from a paid type resource like Accurate or Accurate Advance, or by visiting the other states' UCC lien search sites. From the main page, select Other Debtor Search options. Enter the vendor's name. Limit the search to federal tax liens only. You must disclose and assess any open state tax warrants and/or federal tax liens on your vendor responsibility profile. We recommend following up with the vendor for status of repayment, since this is money owed to government entities. This may prompt the vendor to repay it sooner than they wanted, so they do not jeopardize the reward. Basically, you're putting the vendor on notice that you're aware of this outstanding debt. What if the vendor has a lot of satisfied or paid in full tax warrants? Should you follow up? It depends, especially on the dollar value. Did they pay promptly? This might be an indication of the vendor's management philosophy or integrity. Is there a history of not paying taxes until warrants are issued? The New York State Attorney General's Office press releases is a good source to see if the vendor was investigated or involved in a settlement with New York State. Searching the vendor's name is easier than reviewing the press releases by month. Select Search in the upper right corner, enter the vendor's name, then click the Search button. OSC performs audits of agencies and authorities, programs, and contracts. When the audit is finalized, it will be made available on the public website. While the focus of an audit may be the agency's policies, procedures, over a program or monitoring of a contract, the reports may identify potential issues related to the vendor. To search this site, type the vendor's name into Search Audits. This is a database of companies with histories of misconduct, such as contract fraud and environmental, ethical, and labor violations. While this resource is geared towards larger companies, it's not a bad idea to include it even for smaller to mid-sized vendors, just to be on the safe side. The site lists the top 100 contractors by federal contract award amount, but we tend to search the vendor's name in the quick search field. Be aware that some of the issues may be considered outdated or beyond in the past 5 years. The OSHA site is used to verify if the vendor has any serious and/or willful violations. There is a question on all VRQs requesting self-disclosure of any serious or willful violations. The vendor's payment of any penalties is only one component of the corrective action. Another component is the vendor's actions taken to prevent similar violations from reoccurring. This resource is used to view the Governor's Executive Order 192, EO 192 guidance, and the listing of non-responsible vendors. Executive Order 192 imposes continuing vendor responsibility integrity requirements in state contracts for New York State vendors. Key points we want to emphasize. You are to inform OGS of any vendors found non-responsible. OGS will maintain a listing of non-responsible vendors, and agencies wishing to do business with a vendor found on the non-responsible list must obtain a waiver from the counsel to the governor. The approved waiver must be included in the contract procurement record and is required for any transactions sent to OSC for review and approval. A waiver is also considered transactional, and a new one must be provided for each new transaction. However, There is no waiver for vendors who have been debarred. The Department of Labor hosts a debarment search for both DOL prevailing wage violations and the Workers' Compensation Board breaks in coverage or other violations. If you click on the DOL and WCB links, it will provide information on a debarment and how long of a debarment. If a vendor is debarred and they are precluded from bidding on any public works contract, you cannot make an award to them. If it is not public works, it becomes a responsibility issue that you should obtain the details of and the vendor's corrective action to properly assess on the VR profile, as individuals and businesses both can be debarred. Include owners and officers in your search. Other states may have vendor debarment lists. We tend to use these sites when the vendor is out of state or there's a likelihood that a New York State vendor may also do business in states bordering or near New York State. This is an example of New Jersey's debarment site. It is not unusual for a vendor debarred in neighboring states to come to New York State for business. The Workers' Compensation Board's public coverage search website is used to verify the vendor's workers' compensation and disability benefits proof of insurance. Search on the vendor's FEIN or name. Verify the coverage period matches the documentation provided as proof of coverage. It is important to note that the vendor's name and FEIN provided on the workers' compensation and disability insurance certificates must exactly match the vendor's name and its associated FEIN on the contract record. Accord forms are not acceptable proof of workers' comp and disability insurance coverage. For a listing of acceptable proofs, please refer to the workers' comp website. The information can also be found on page 6 of the workers' comp Prove It to Move It document. If a vendor provides an exemption certificate for either workers' compensation or disability insurance or both, look at the vendor's exemption reason to ensure that it's reasonable. Consider the type of vendor it is, the work that is to be performed under the contract, and where this work will occur. If the reasonableness of the exemption isn't apparent, you may want to follow up with the vendor.
Thank you, Renee. Here we are covering some contract-specific resources, grants, and not-for-profits in construction. If a not-for-profit does not file their 990 for 3 years in a row, then tax-exempt status is revoked. Implication for VR is that the vendor will be violating their charity's registration. This is the main source for the vendor's IRS 990 tax forms. To get access, you will need to contact the Division of Budget. Review for the vendor's financial condition. Look for fiscal year-end net losses, negative fund balances, material decreases in fund balance, and any significant diversion of assets. All not-for-profits are required to pre-qualify prior to grant application and execution of contracts. If the vendor isn't pre-qualified, you should not be evaluating proposals for existing competitive grant opportunities submitted or signing any grant contracts, renewals, or amendments with the not-for-profit. If, for some reason, the vendor has not added their 990s to the grants gateway, they can also be found through the Charities Registry link in the AG resource or in the IRS Automatic Revocation of Exemption list if they are required to file. The Office of the Inspector General negotiates corporate integrity agreements with healthcare providers and other entities as part of the settlement of federal healthcare program investigations arising under a variety of civil false claims statutes. Providers or entities agree to the obligations, and in exchange, OIG agrees not to seek their exclusion from participation in Medicare, Medicaid, or other federal health care programs. The Vendor Responsibility Questionnaire calls for the vendor to disclose any government audits within the past 3 years. This OMIG resource contains audit detail relating to vendors who are Medicaid providers, including quality of care and overpayment information. Overpayments, material weaknesses, or significant deficiencies noted in the audit report should be addressed by the vendor and assessed on your profile. You will also want to look at the Office of Management and Budget site to review the vendor's most recent A133 report, more commonly called the Single Audit Report. By federal law, non-federal entities that receive $500,000 or more in federal awards annually are required to have a single or program-specific audit conducted for that award year. This audit is performed by independent auditors. Review the single audits to see if there are any going concerns, significant deficiency, material weakness, or material noncompliance findings. The last two resources to bring to your attention are for construction contracts. This is the New York City School Construction Authority website. Vendors listed on here are disqualified, suspended, ineligible, and/or rejected to receive new work in School Construction Authority projects. If your vendor is found here and has not disclosed it on their VRQ, you need to ask them why and assess it on your profile. This is a listing of all professionally licensed firms and individuals in New York State. If your contract is with a licensed professional, like an architecture firm, you are going to want to look here and make sure they are licensed to practice in New York State. Please be sure that the firm itself is licensed and not just an individual. Once you locate your vendor, you can see when they first filed and whether or not that filing is current. Also, any employees that are licensed to practice in New York State are listed here under the firm. The search files can be a bit sensitive. Sometimes the architecture firm will be listed under Architecture and Engineering or Architecture and Landscape Architecture. You may need to try a few professions before you locate your vendor. If they are not licensed, you will need to contact the vendor. Here are additional resources to use depending upon the type of vendor you're contracting with. New York State Empire State Development Certified, MWBE, verifies certification for women and minority-owned businesses. New York State Education Department Higher Education verifies legitimacy of New York State colleges and universities. New York State Department of State Bureau of Licensing for licenses not covered under the NYSID professional site. As pointed out in the individual resource reviews, OSC reviews officers, owners, parent companies, and affiliates. OSC recommends you review the resources identified here for these entities as well. These are important as the possibility exists that any financial or legal trouble that exists for the individuals or associates could affect the vendor, whether outright or behind the scenes. In addition to performing affirmative responsibility reviews on vendors the state is contracting with directly, you should also perform responsibility reviews on all subcontractors that will perform work and services under state contracts. A subcontractor is any entity that receives money from the prime vendor to perform work required under the contract. Examples of contracts that may have subs are construction contracts, grants contracts, state contracts with municipalities, leases, and contracts with preferred source vendors. Best practice is to perform vendor responsibility reviews for all subcontractors, even for contract transactions that do not require OSC review or approval. Subcontractors must be responsible too. They are required to abide by the same contract requirements and agency vetting process. This applies to the vendor responsibility as well. Reviewing subcontractors prior to contract award affords you the opportunity to raise questions to the prime vendor about the sub's qualifications and responsibility before the contract starts or before the sub starts work. You should review a subcontractor the same way you would review a prime vendor, following the vendor review process for due diligence and using the previously discussed resources that touch upon the 4 vendor responsibility factors. A detailed subcontractor responsibility review will help you answer the following questions. Does the sub have the financial and organizational capacity to perform the work, such as staffing, expertise, equipment, and finances? Does it have the legal authority to do business? For instance, is the business registered with the New York State Department of State if required? Is the out-of-state vendor in good standing? Does the vendor have the required licenses for their profession and the required workers' compensation and disability coverage? Do they appear on any debarment lists that prohibit them from contracting with New York State, such as Workers' Compensation Board or Department of Labor debarment lists? Are there any findings that cause concerns regarding the vendor's integrity? For instance, are there findings of any criminal indictments or convictions, outstanding tax liabilities, or prior findings of non-responsibility? Is there evidence of government audits or investigations requiring resolutions or corrective actions? Lastly, you should review past performance. Is there evidence of the subcontractor having contracts terminated for cause? Has the subcontractor previously abandoned any government contract? It is recommended that in addition to reviewing the regular resources, you should review the relationships between the prime vendor and subcontractors. Look for apparent adverse connections between the prime and sub. Check the original bidders list to see if any of the subs for the awarded vendor also bid on the same contract. Lastly, check available resources to ensure the subcontractor has the required certifications needed to perform work under the contract. Just because the sub identifies itself as a minority or woman-owned business enterprise doesn't automatically mean they're a New York State certified MWBE business. We still must perform our due diligence and confirm that they are properly certified with the Department of Economic Development. It is part of verifying that the vendor has the legal authority to perform work under that designation. As stated in OSC's Guide to Financial Operations, a vendor responsibility profile and questionnaire are required for a sub when the subcontractor is known at the time of the contract award and the sub will receive $100,000 or more over the life of the contract. This is the bare minimum documentation requirement. Submission of workers' compensation and disability insurance certificates are not required for subcontractors. However, when you are verifying the sub's actual workers' compensation and disability insurance coverage and determine that they do not have coverage but are required to, you may want to obtain a copy of the certificates to support the responsibility determination that they have the legal authority to do business in New York State. Here are some things to look out for when performing responsibility reviews on subcontractors. A sudden drop of revenue or net income could indicate mismanagement or potential fraud. Remember, you want to be sure the vendor is financially viable to perform work under the contract. Any evidence of a connection between the prime and the sub. For example, a subcontractor's name consisting of initials that appear to be the same initials of the prime vendor's officers or key personnel. Or the sub sharing one or more officers or key personnel of the prime vendor, or sharing phone numbers, email addresses, or physical building address with the prime. All these instances should raise questions or potential red flag concerns that would need to be explained by the vendor. Let's recap. Perform a vendor responsibility review on all subcontractors. Use the same standards for a subcontractor review that you would for the prime contractor. Address with the prime contractor any vendor responsibility issues found with the sub. Look for potential red flags, including inappropriate relationships between the prime and sub vendors. A complete vendor responsibility profile will provide detail concerning each issue found by you or self-disclosed by the vendor. Explain the corrective actions taken to resolve the issue or mitigate future occurrences. Provide your assessment of each issue, explaining how it impacts or does not impact your responsibility determination. For instructions on how to complete the agency responsibility profile, please access OSC's Completing the Vendor Responsibility Profile video available on the statewide learning management system. We hope the vendor will disclose any and all information that is asked of them, but sometimes they miss something. In some cases, the review has been done for days, weeks, or months before it comes to OSC for review. Whatever the case, if we feel something needs a closer look, please give it your best assessment. Here are 2 simple tips to help you avoid the dreaded VR calls and emails. Scan all VR items together or scan each VR doc individually. Be sure the individual documents are labeled correctly: profile, workers' compensation, VRQ, etc. Just a reminder, per Section 139J of State Finance Law, OSC cannot communicate directly with the vendors. Any questions or concerns that they may have should go to a designated agency contact. That contact can then correspond with OSC for clarification. The vendors should also not be emailing or calling OSC directly with answers to any issues that have been found. All information must be filtered through the contracting agency. Please feel free to call or email any of us on the vendor responsibility team if you have any questions or concerns.
Thank you for being here for Vendor Responsibility Basics. We will now turn it over for any questions that you may have. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat, and our moderator will pass it along to our presenters. Thanks again.
All right. Once again, thank you for your time and attention during our presentation, and we will address some questions that we got during the presentation, as well as some general questions that we often get on the responsibility team. Danielle, do you want to do the first question?
Okay, so the first question we were asked is, what is the web address to get to liens and corporation search? All of those searches are on the Department of State website. The first for the corporation search is https://corp_public/corp_search.entity_search_entry. For liens, https://apps.pls/pls/web_search.lien_frame. And for tax warrants, https://www.dos.ny.gov/corp_warrant_search.html, and I will place those in the chat so anyone can copy and paste them into their web search. Mia, you want to take the next one?
Thanks, Danielle. Okay, so I'm going to just share with you a question that we often get on the vendor responsibility team. When completing the agency profile, how much detail do I have to go into? So the profile on the attachment A of the profile, there is on the left-hand side, that's where you want to describe the issue. And on the right-hand side, that's where you want to give the agency resolution and the assessment. So on the left side of the attachment A to the profile, you want to fully describe the issue, giving the reader a clear picture of what occurred. You will want to include pertinent information identifying the parties involved, the date of the occurrence, and enough detail to let the reader know what happened. On the right side, you want to provide detail on how this issue was addressed. This can include the actions taken by the vendor or the parties involved to resolve the issue, and steps taken by the vendor and your agency to minimize risk or mitigate future occurrences. And finally, you want to include your agency's assessment. A statement or a series of statements explaining how this issue impacts or does not impact your agency's determination of the vendor's responsibility. Let me give you an example. Say if I was at an agency and I needed to include an OSHA violation on attachment A of the profile, I may write, vendor was fined a 2018 OSHA violation deemed as serious for a laboratory spill resulting in employee fall and a leg injury. So this gives all the details, the time of the occurrence, what happened. And then on the other side, where I want to discuss the agency resolution and the agency's assessment, I may write, the vendor paid a fine and implemented mandatory employee training regarding cleaning techniques. Our agency is satisfied with the corrective actions taken by the vendor and finds the vendor responsible. So there I'm giving what was the resolution as well as my agency's assessment of the vendor's actions and the determination of the vendor's overall responsibility. Please remember, when you are doing these profiles or creating the profiles, what we're looking for is the assessment of the agency, of the vendor's overall responsibility, not whether you found them to be responsible for that particular contract. Okay? Let's go on to another question. Danielle?
Thanks, Mia. So another commonly asked question is, how often does the vendor questionnaire need to be recertified? The main answer is it has to be certified within 6 months of the agency review of the vendor. It doesn't have to be every 6 months for the vendor to do it, but within 6 months of your review, it needs to be certified. Mia, you got another one?
Sure, and I just want to add on to Danielle's comment regarding the questionnaire. We want to just remind everybody that we do encourage the vendors to complete the online questionnaire. It's easy for the vendors to be certified that way. And then the online system does contain a notification feature that allows your agency's authorized users to go ahead and to receive notice anytime the the vendor has been certified updating the questionnaire. So it's very useful. All right, so I see that we have another question regarding the link that Danielle gave details to earlier. And basically the question is, how far back should found responsibility issues go? In most cases, I'm going to say basically best practice is to go 5 years on most cases. But as far as the vendor responsibility questionnaire, it does point out that audits are typically 3 years, bankruptcies are 7 years. And so you want to make sure that you are, and that the vendor is disclosing and you're looking that far enough to give a full picture of the vendor's responsibility. All righty.
Okay, another commonly asked question we get is, why isn't it enough to just address the information disclosed on the questionnaire? We hope the vendor is going to disclose everything we ask of them, but sometimes things just go over or get overlooked. Also, new issues could have arrived since they last updated their questionnaire. And then sometimes it's just stuff they don't want us to find. So we want to make sure we're getting everything we can find and focusing on it and asking them all the relevant questions.
There was a few questions that came in that were sent to host instead of panelists. So the first one of those was, would you talk about the requirement for subcontractor New York State vendor ID numbers?
Okay, so according to the GFO, whoever is going to perform business with New York State, they need to go ahead and have that vendor ID. So in order to get a vendor ID, they can do one of two things. They can get the assistance from your agency to initiate the process. They can also contact the IT OSC's help desk and, start the process there. So yes, subs are typically required to have their ID as well. I hope that answers your question. If you need more information on that, please feel free to send a chat through, or, contact us directly. Here's another question regarding the debarment. Question reads, why do I need to check the debarment list if I don't work on public work contracts? So the answer is, while certain federal and state agencies have statutory provisions prohibiting debarred vendors from bidding on public work contracts, the Governor's Executive Order 192 calls for continued vendor responsibility past contract award, meaning throughout the term of the contract. And this applies to all contracts, regardless if it's public works or not. So during the course of your vendor responsibility review, you want to check the debarment list, the MTA debarment list, that's the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the U.S. government GSA site, as well as the Workers' Comp Board and DOL debarment database. If you find that your vendor does have an active debarment, you want to include your assessment of this issue on the profile. You want to detail the nature or the reason for the debarment. Any corrective actions taken by the vendor is applicable, for example, a paid fine, and explain why, in light of EO 192, you believe your agency can contract with this vendor or continue to contract with this vendor. Next question. I see that I might be fading out.
I have another one that came directly to the host, It says, can you provide guidance on vendor responsibility reviews for discretionary purchases that do not need to be pre-approved by OSC?
Okay, so we recommend the best process or the best practice is to do a thorough responsibility review, whether the contract is coming to OSC for review or approval or not. And what you can do is use those suggested resources in the presentation, as well as the resources that we have on our online, the VendRep site, and really conduct a review, because you want to make sure that you are contracting with responsible vendors, regardless if the contract comes to OSC for approval or not. So it's really, you're following the same process. Is there another question, Danielle?
Oh, yeah, sure. One of the questions we also get is if I've addressed an issue on a previous contract, do I have to address it again? Yes, you do have to address it again. Each contract is its own document. I found one of the best ways to actually keep this is to create a living document. So if you're working with a vendor yearly or constantly, you want to have all of the information there, and then as the information gets older, drop it off. As new stuff gets found, add it on, and that way you will always have whatever issues the vendor needs to disclose and what you need to assess.
All righty. I have one more question. Does a non-responsibility finding mean I can't contract with a vendor? Not necessarily. A waiver can be applied from the Council for the Governor. This is in respect to Executive Order 192. Waivers are transactional. New waivers are needed for new contracts and new transactions, meaning if your agency received a waiver to contract with this vendor in the past and you want to enter into a new contract with this vendor, the new waiver is needed. If the contract or amendment is subject to OSC review, please include the waiver with your submission. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions.
Another question that came to the host. Just wanted to double check. Can you confirm that workers' comp and disability certificates are not required to be submitted for subs?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Sure. It says, just wanted to double check. Can you confirm that workers' comp and disability certificates are not required to be submitted for subs?
That is correct. The prime vendor does have to have workers' compensation and disability coverage. If they're in New York, if the sub is a New York State entity for authority to do business purposes, they should have the workers' comp and disability, but the proofs aren't required.
And another that came to host, if federal lien or state tax warrant is found, what should the agency request of the vendor as proof of payment?
I'm sorry, Trish, could you repeat that one more time?
Of course, if a federal lien or state tax warrant is found, what should the agency request of the vendor as proof of repayment?
Okay, the vendor should be getting a letter from the government stating that the payment has been made or payment is in the process of being made. If they have a repayment plan in process or whatever. We just want to know that they are working toward getting it paid if they have not already paid it.
So are the workers' comp and disability certificates required to be in the name of the contractor, even if the stamp or cover under another contracted workers' comp and disability? So yes, the workers' comp documentation and disability documentation, they need to be the same vendor name and the same vendor SEIN as the contract on record, as a vendor on record. So that is what we require as part of the documentation. We do realize that there are, or there may be extenuating circumstances. In those cases, we really recommend that we direct you to the Workers' Compensation Board Compliance Division, that you talk to them about the requirements, and if they see that there is some type of outlying qualifier that makes your different documentation okay to you, we would expect you to provide evidence of that okay from what the Workers' Comp Board. We have another question regarding leases. Are leases always subcontracts? The answer is no. If the landlord is doing their work on their own, we do not, need any type of subcontractor information. But if they are hiring help to do lawn services, cleaning, things like that, yes, we do. If they are subcontractors have to do anything regarding that lease, they really should be looking at who they're hiring, or we're looking at them as subcontractors.
Okay, so we have the question, what if a grantee is not current on charity's reg? They actually have to be current. They won't get paid if they're not.
And you want to, if you can verify their registration status, you can contact the, the AG Charities Reg Bureau, and to get the clarification from them. If they're exempt, the Registry Charities Bureau would be able to give you that finding as well.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Just type them in the chat. We'll answer them if we can. So this question here, the hard copy VRQ and the online VRQ through the VendRep system have different dates of when you need to have the form certified by. The paper copy has more time given than the online version. Is there a reason for this? We just require or recommend that they get recertified within 6 months of a review. We are trying to get away from the paper VRQs and get more onto the online ones. It just gives everyone an opportunity to update it as soon as the information is found, and that way they don't have to think about it each time they have to fill out a new paper VRQ. Okay, if there are no other questions, you guys can email us if anything comes up in later. Oh, we did get another question. Are paper VRQs also good for 6 months or 1 year? They are good for 6 months from the bid due date.
Alrighty. I see there are no more questions at this time, but please feel free to email us with any questions that come to mind. We really want to thank you again for your time and attention, and to remind you that a survey will be going out. We ask that you can complete it. Alrighty, so I really just want to say, remember again that the presentation will be with the questions and answers will be made available on the internet, and we will answer any questions that we didn't get to during that time. So once again, thank you, and have a nice day.